The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery, and of course I'm Al Warren, and co-host, cohort, whatever you call it.
Riding shotgun.
Yeah, back, David Rose, Bad Back Martino.
Bad Back Martino, yeah.
If you're practicing your karate again, you know, that's just...
Yeah, just threw my back out, right?
Yeah. Oh, I know. See,
terrible.
I think as I know the truth. I know. It was because your wife, you didn't take her to the Run DMC concert. So
that's right, and she put me in a joint lock, and
yeah, and she
threw me on
down
the ground.
Stairs a couple of times. Well, I'll tell you.
There's no video of it, so it didn't happen.
Yeah, take the back seat. You deserve it anyway.
I do.
Like I said, it could be worse. You could be on a... No, never mind. I'm not going to say. That was... I know I'm going to get in trouble for that. So I think I better stay away from that section because, we get in trouble all the time. Well, anyway, we've got another great show coming up. Now, we're going to be talking to an author again. Jeez, we're doing a lot of authors lately. Should take up writing. Well, this guy, he's got a new book out called Shoot the Moonlight Out. And this is I don't know, it looks like he's done a lot of books, at least 5, 6 here. William Boyle, thank you for being on the show.
Oh, yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, we'll see if you say that at the end of the show. You might see if you don't. We've only kicked one person out this week, so. True. Well, that was beyond when you start talking about the Bilderbergs and all that conspiracy stuff and lizard people. It was like, come on, I'm done. We're done. You haven't seen any lizard people lately, have you, over in New York?
No. I'm actually in Mississippi, so I'm from New York, but I live in Mississippi, so maybe I did. Maybe I did. They were just kind of undercover lizard people.
Yeah, because you just never know. Do you like to write about lizards or no?
I don't think I've ever written about a lizard, and I don't anticipate writing about one.
Now, it could be a great add-on to your next book. Think about it.
Yeah, maybe I will. I'll put some thought into it.
Yeah, they come out and they're really a lizard in there. It looks like you now. So you are. How do you consider yourself? What kind of writer? Like crime fiction sort of writer?
Yeah. I generally call myself a crime writer.
How did that come about? Like what got you into the crime fiction?
I loved crime fiction from a pretty young age. I was getting assigned stuff in school that I didn't like, and when I was around 10 or 11, I started reading writers like Ed McBain, and I just kind of tapped into that world and just kept discovering stuff at the library and read Elmore Leonard and Jim Thompson and James Ellroy and a bunch of writers like that when I was pretty young, and so I had a taste for it as a kid, and then kind of my tastes go all over the place. But I think when I finally started to figure out who I was as a writer, I mean, I've always written and always wanted to be a writer, but I kind of didn't know what I wanted to do, if I wanted to write poetry or write screenplays or write plays or whatever. But by the time I was about 18, I guess I'd figured out that I wanted to write fiction, and my taste was all over the place, like I said, but probably by my mid-20s or early 20s, I kind of figured out that I wanted to write character-driven, place-driven crime fiction.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, but was there a particular incident that ignited your thing to write? And I say that because, we both write here, right? And of course I published books, but I don't consider myself a good writer. So what got you brave enough to actually decide that you should publish these books?
I don't know if there was one particular incident. It was just kind of one of those things that always always wanted as a kid. I just started, as pretty much as far back as I can remember, certainly age 7 or so, I was writing stories, and by high school I was writing a lot and pretty weirdly pretty disciplined. I was writing garbage, but I was working hard at it. And then, I don't know. I think I just, it took me a while. I didn't have a model for it really. I mean, I knew there were writers I loved, and I loved going to bookstores and libraries, but I didn't know any writers really. And, so it was really not until my early 30s that I started, publishing.
But I guess what I'm saying is you mustn't really have a fear then. Like you write and you put it out and you have enough confidence that you're not really worried about people that dislike it or say bad things.
No, I mean, I think I've always had kind of a thick skin when it comes to that stuff. I kind of have a mentality of just like, you just have to be able to take those punches. Otherwise you're just not going to you can't be that sensitive about it. Nobody's, most people probably aren't going to read it, number one. And then the people that do are going to be split on whether they like it or not. So, different people have different tastes, and I just, I try to approach it. I'm a huge fan of so much stuff, books and movies and music. I just kind of try to think about it, as a fan. I'm not that way. I kind of talk about, there's stuff I don't like, but I don't generally talk about that stuff. I kind of focus on the stuff I love.
Yeah. Well, you're from Brooklyn. You're tough. But not only that, I don't really understand today's culture in the sense of, you turn on a radio show, you think, oh, this is garbage, or I don't like it. You flip the channel, right? Or just like you get a book and you read it and go, oh, it's not my style. But people love to comment, get online. Get a big thing going which I'm not sure why, because why not just do something else, but that's the world.
I don't get it. There's no value in it for me. It kind of makes me feel bad about things, and what doesn't make me feel bad about things is talking about stuff I love. That makes me feel productive and feels more meaningful.
Now, I noticed this is they classified your new book as vigilante justice thrillers. Okay, so are we talking about like the old what was that Death Wish type? Remember with Charles Bronson? Yeah. Actually, based on a really good novel by a writer named John Garfield. I don't know. I wouldn't quite. They use a lot of classification terms for books. I don't really think of it as a vigilante book, though there is a little bit of that thread in the book. There's a character who is kind of doling out neighborhood justice, but it's maybe a little bit of a misleading tag. It's certainly not the whole of the book. It's one little thread in the book. Well, that's interesting. So now when you go to write this book, for instance, like you're talking about the characters, so and you like character-driven sort of stories. So where do you get your characters from? Like, how do they come to you?
A variety of places, I guess. I like ensemble casts. I like big sprawling casts. And this novel is set in it starts in 1996, and then the bulk of it is set in June of 2001 in southern Brooklyn. So I definitely kind of go back to my memories of growing up there and people I knew. I use a little bit of that. I certainly draw from my own experiences. But I also like just making stuff up, and I like kind of the mythology aspect of writing about Brooklyn, and so there's a lot of different places they come from. I'm influenced certainly by books I'm reading and movies I'm watching, and so I think all that stuff kind of gets filtered in there in some way.
Yeah, yeah, and so the title itself, "Shoot the Moonlight Out." Where does that come from? What does that mean?
It comes from there's a musician I really love named Garland Jeffries. And he was kind of a big discovery for me. I got into him through Lou Reed, who I really love Lou Reed. And I read an interview with Lou Reed somewhere along the line, and he was talking about Garland Jeffries, who was putting out albums he's still putting out records actually that are really good. But he kind of came on the scene in the 70s, New York guy. And so this album, this is a song title of his, "Shoot the Moonlight Out." It's a song I really love. And, I just kind of, I very often for titles, I think I'm either thinking about, place names or song titles. And so this was a song title that just kind of inspired me and prompted something in me. And I kind of sat down with the title and started working from there. I mean, it's got no real connection to this. The book has no connection to the song beyond kind of the tone and atmosphere it helped me create. But it was just a title I loved, and I started going from there.
Now, you mostly write about Brooklyn and Brooklyn of the past, and I know you grew up in Brooklyn, but is there something specific about Brooklyn that calls to you to write these books?
It's just, especially the last couple of books, I've gone back to the 90s and the early 2000s and kind of the time that I lived there most intimately. So I think, I'm a big advocate of writing about what haunts you, and that's the place that haunts me the most. It's where I grew up. It's where my family is still there. I'm not currently there, but I just go there when I sit down to write. It's the place that I automatically return to, and I feel like I've kind of been over a few books been building a version of my Brooklyn, kind of blend of the Brooklyn I've known and some mythological, imaginary Brooklyn. And it's just kind of I don't know, I've been populating it with people, and kind of, there are characters I will drop into one book for a page and then, think about and wonder about and want to return to, in another book. So I think it's just kind of the place that I go, the place I want to spend time when I'm writing.
So in a way, you're kind of writing New York as a character itself.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, at least my version of it. Yeah. The way I've known it, the way I've seen it, the way I imagine it. It's a big character to me. I've always loved and responded to, stuff that is really rooted in place. So, when I live in Mississippi now, I live in Oxford, Mississippi, and one of the things that drew me down here originally was the writer Larry Brown, who I love, and he, the way he wrote about Mississippi was the way ultimately I wanted to write about New York, and so that was a big influence in terms of thinking about place early on.
Well, yeah. So your main character, if you were to describe, like I guess you do an ensemble, but I think what is it? It's I can't even say his last name. Bobby Santovasco.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Good name. How would you describe that character?
Well, yeah, he's kind of. I mean, he's to me not really the main character of the book, but definitely one of the 3 or 4 main characters. And he's a young character. The book opens with him. He's a kid in the first section, and then just a little bit older in the rest of the book. And he's a character who does, in the opening chapter, in the prologue, I should say, does something stupid that spins out of control and has fatal consequences. And so he's a character that's shaped by that bad decision and becomes kind of self-destructive. But then it also opens up into something else for him as he tries to get away from that. So he's one of the main characters. And I think I always kind of tend to alternate between younger characters who are wanting to get out of the neighborhood, and older characters who are stuck in the neighborhood. And they're both kind of, or, settled in the neighborhood, I should say, I guess. The younger characters often feel trapped and want to escape. And the older characters have kind of settled into their way of living, or, given up or whatever.
When you write these characters like Bobby and some of these other younger or older characters, can you hear their voices in your head? I mean, I know I hear voices when I write, but I just wonder if you can, if you hear them, if you're more translating what you're seeing in your mind, images, and turning that into prose.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about. I don't know. Yeah, I definitely hear something. I love dialogue, and I've always loved writing dialogue. And as a kid, I used to just sit around and tape my grandparents talking, and then transcribe their conversations. And so I think when I'm writing dialogue, I do hear kind of hear their voices to a certain extent. I definitely, hear kind of rhythms of speaking, the way people speak. I don't know that it's, crystal clear, like I'm hearing a certain person saying something a certain way, but there's definitely kind of an interior thing going on for me when I'm writing dialogue. And the same goes for just kind of seeing it. I mean, definitely, I love films, and I'm definitely inspired by a lot of films. So there's part of me that is seeing the action unfold as if it were a movie, or seeing certain actors in certain roles, things like that.
Yeah, well, that's all right. And don't worry, Dave's a little bit insane, so
Yeah, that's true.
He hears voices, and they tell him to do things, and it kind of gets a little crazy at times, right? So you just kind of keep your distance from him. So do you actually take real people in your life and make them characters, or if you're like let's say you've gone to the store, you're going through the drive-through to get some sort of McDonald's or something, and someone cuts you off, or someone does something rude, do you take that person and put them in your book and maybe have them tortured or shot? I'm asking for a friend.
Yeah, I've definitely used, I've used, to a certain extent, I've used parts of people, I'd say. I'm definitely, writing is so much about observation, about what you see, and kind of collecting things along the way. So I think subconsciously, even there are things that are always showing up in what you're working on, or in what I'm working on. There's not usually some very specific things where I've totally based someone on someone that I know or have seen, but definitely pieces of people are kind of always showing up. I mean, certainly pieces of myself are always showing up in characters, and pieces of my mom and my grandparents are kind of always showing up in characters. But not probably in a case like that, probably that's not something I would use. But if it was somebody I'd kind of known well, they would probably in some way, even in disguise, kind of show up in the text.
Okay, give us some names here. Let's get to the real stuff here. Who are you torturing in your books? People want to know. Would you?
There is one guy.
Oh, no, okay, perfect. There we go.
I'm just kidding.
Did you actually write a theme in your book itself, or does it just come out? Do you think, like some sort of at the end of the story? Underlying, is there some sort of message you always try to get across in a book?
I don't think I'm ever setting out for that. No, I mean, I think there are kind of themes that I'm obsessed with, that are kind of always showing up and appearing in whatever I'm writing. And then there are themes that kind of occasionally work themselves into a book. And so those things. And in this book, I think like it's definitely, there's a lot about forgiveness and grief. So that stuff, it's not something that I'm consciously thinking about at the outset, but certainly kind of, comes to the surface as I'm working.
How long does it take you to write a book? And for instance, this book, what was the process for you? How long?
It depends from book to book. This was written during the kind of early to middle stage of the pandemic. So actually it was a pretty quick book, but I was home, I was working pretty nonstop. I didn't have travel or other stuff that usually gets in the way and breaks up my writing time. This was probably the first draft of it was probably a few months, and then the revision process took a few months. So I think all told it was probably 8 or 9 months.
Well, I was just wondering, has a character ever done anything to surprise you? Have they refused to do something or just kind of gone off the rails and decided they were going to do something that didn't kind of match up with the plot?
Yeah. I love that. That's one of my favorite things about writing is that even I'm not a huge, or I wasn't in the beginning anyway, a huge planner. In the last couple of books, I've tended to figure things out a little bit more beforehand, just so I could try to cut trouble off at the pass. But still, I always want to leave room for wandering and for exploration, for detours, and just so I like that, and I like when I expect a character to turn right and they turn left and they do something that I wasn't expecting. So yeah, that's happened. And in this book, actually, this wasn't specifically one character, but there was it wasn't one character doing something. It was more that a character showed up who I had no intention of being in the book and just kind of took over at a certain point. So that was a really fun thing to have happen for me.
Are you one of those writers that you're able to sit down and kind of go, okay, I'm clear between 1 and 4 today, so I'm going to sit down and write, and then 7 o'clock tomorrow night I'm clear, so I can write. Can you just sit down and turn it on, or do you have to be in a mood?
I require definitely early in the morning. I mean, if I can, when I'm working on something, I get up at 5 and I write from 5 to 8 or 5 to 9. And that's really usually the most important time to me, the time when I get the best writing done. And when I'm working on a book, I really, really prefer, if I can, to be doing it every day. I mean, it's going to be obviously different for different people, but I try to work on books at stretches of time where I know I'm not traveling or not doing anything like that, so I don't lose the flow of it. But yeah, so it's really important for me to work the early mornings usually, and then I tend to revise and kind of rework stuff in the afternoons. But mornings are really, really important for me.
How did COVID go for you in the way of writing? Did it affect the way you wrote, or did it change how you wrote, or any sort of process in there?
It was actually, I don't mean to make it sound positive because it was such a terrible time in so many ways, but it was suited my lifestyle well. I wrote early every morning, and I wrote I wrote a lot. And I think I kind of allowed myself to get lost in that, and that kind of kept me sane during the hardest stretch of it. It also allowed me to, my ideal day is writing and then reading and watching movies and listening to music and of course hanging out with my family. So that's pretty much what I was doing all the time, every day. And it really creatively was a good period for me because I was reading a lot, I was watching a lot of films, and when I'm doing that, it's kind of feeding the creativity, I think. And so it worked out. I mean, it was a pretty good time for me in terms of getting work done.
So, but do you think it was going to be a little bit darker the way you wrote? Did you kill more people in this book, or feel more negative? Oh, it's just that, because when you're I don't know about you, but when you're sitting in a stressful environment, the things around you are really upsetting or going on, and even if it's not COVID, but when there's some other things going on, does that, and you're kind of under the gun, so to speak, to write. Do you think it's a darker way of writing? Do you think you come out a little bit meaner? Or?
I think, actually maybe it worked the opposite for me a little bit, because my books are generally pretty dark. And so I think on this book, maybe I got a little bit more hope in there than I usually do. And maybe that had something to do with my mindset at the time. I was kind of looking for that hope where I could get it. Don't get me wrong. It's dark, and it's pretty violent, and there's plenty of meanness in there, but there's also a little bit of hope shining through, I think so.
Wow. So you and I, if someone's never heard of you, I know it might be
most people probably.
No, there might be one or two out there. They've never heard of you before, and they go, "Oh my God, who is this guy?" And they were to buy one book. Which book would you recommend to them of yours to buy that you would kind of guess it would kind of cover what kind of writer you are?
I think I'm always kind of thinking about the most recent one. So I would say this one, Shoot the Moonlight Out. And if not this one, if somebody didn't want to buy a book in hardcover, I would say the last one, City of Margins, which kind of, to me, these two books are kind of a culmination of a lot of stuff that I've been building towards. And I think I've gone back, to the 90s and the early 2000s, which is a time that I like writing about a lot. So they're pretty representative, I think.
I was wondering, you've talked about some influences. Do you have any influences that might surprise fans?
Oh man, yeah, I would imagine I've got a lot of influences that would surprise people, because I think I'm all over the place in terms of what I like, and in fact, pretty often I think that the stuff that people wouldn't expect, or as in terms of being influenced by things, I think it's important to read outside your genre and watch things outside your genre, and so. I don't know. I don't even know where to start. I have so many influences that show up. One, I can talk about the director. I was just thinking about her, the director, Lynn Shelton, who passed away last year. I think people would be probably surprised to know that her work had a huge impact on me, and in particular on these last couple of books. So there's stuff like that, but there's stuff across the spectrum in terms of movies and music and books. I think, old screwball comedies and pre-code cinema, and all sorts of music, and tons of writers. Certainly, probably a lot of writers outside the crime fiction genre, literary writers, sci-fi writers, whatever. So yeah, tons of stuff.
Did you read Dave's books? Is that it? Are you a big fan? Right? Come on, You're supposed to pick one of the hosts and say, "Yeah, I like it." Your writing has been a big influence on me.
Yeah, you guys have been a huge influence on me.
See? Now we're talking. We're going to get you on prime time now. This is like not messing around here. Oh yeah. The '90s was a pretty good time for me. Did you really like the '90s? Is that why you go back there?
Well, it was just such a formative time for me. I was born in '78, so I was 12. Turned 12 in 1990, and then I was 22 or 21 or 22 at the end of the 90s. So it was this really, in terms of discovery, in terms of the writers I was reading, the films I was watching, the music I was listening to, it was everything comes back to that time, really. But it was also, I think, artistically, it was an interesting time in America. I mean, it was just a great independent film scene. There was great music scene that, even popular mainstream kind of stuff was good, at least for a stretch there in the early 90s. And so it was just this truly formative time for me. I started it in junior high and I ended it in college. And in that 10-year stretch, I discovered just everything. It was everything I loved, and also an aesthetic. Generation X kind of slacker aesthetic that still shapes me, I think.
Well, do you think we've had 80s nostalgia? Do you think that 90s nostalgia has hit now, or are we still kind of waiting for that?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know that I can't think of tons of good stuff that has come out that has been set in the 90s, or I can't think of, I guess, a ton of stuff that uses the 90s kind of in that period piece way that the 80s is used now. I mean, the 80s stuff has gotten a little bit out of hand. I think there's just so much kind of bad 80s nostalgia, and people just throw like a windbreaker on a character and give them a boombox or whatever, and call it the 80s. So I don't know. I mean, I think the 90s is not as probably dramatic in terms of like fashion and kind of that weird 80s aesthetic, but it's definitely. It's just the end of an era in so many ways. It's like, pre 9/11, pre-internet. Oh, well, internet was out, but it wasn't, a huge thing. Pre-cell phone, certainly. So it's this kind of just this end of things. It was very, independent spirit kind of stuff in terms of, film and music and literature. So I don't know. I mean, I imagine there'll be probably a good amount of 90s nostalgia, and maybe it's happening and I just don't know it. But for me, it's just more of a personal thing in terms of going back to the place when I lived there and when I knew it, because that's the way I see it in my mind and that's the way I remember it.
Yeah. You must read Dave's books, Boombox and Windbreaker. You've got to be reading his stuff. Well, the 90s was the last really happy time. I think. Yeah, because it seems like everyone's uptight and there's so many things that are happening, and it's always this. We're living in a tense world for some reason. Since 2000, seems like, to me, it feels that way. And the 90s seemed like a really good time. Plus, I got laid a lot in the 90s. That was, things were much better. But what do I know? So where do you plan on going with this? Kind of what's kind of your plan? Are you going to keep writing the crime fiction thriller sort of era, or are you going to kind of go somewhere different?
I just kind of, I think I intend to. I intend to keep writing this world and developing this kind of universe of characters and whatever that I've come up with. I don't know, I have other ideas certainly, but I think I'll probably stay pretty close to this. And even when I stray from it, it'll be of a piece with it tonally and atmospherically. I mean, I think I tend to write dark, character-driven, place-driven stuff, whether it ultimately is rooted in crime or not. But I have a very broad definition of what crime fiction is, so I'll probably always, through that lens, be writing some kind of crime fiction.
Yeah, you could have like the crime of the lizards. They wear dark glasses and they're
90s lizards.
Yeah.
90s lizards, yeah.
90s lizards. Do you like the noir sort of thing, like the black and white sort of old detective sort of stories?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I love that. That stuff really, literally, kind of changed my life. I just kind of looked across it when I was young, and never really saw the world the same way again. So it was huge. It was a huge discovery for me as a kid. I tend to like. I'm not a huge detective. Like I like plenty of detective stuff. I like Hammett and Chandler. Yeah, I like a lot of that stuff. But for the most part, I like the more kind of the bleaker noir. Detour was a big film for me as a kid, and still is. Huge influence on me.
Yeah, yeah. There's some really good. I always watch the TCM one all the time.
Oh yeah, Noir Alley.
Yeah. Listen to the stations as well, like the old shows and stuff like that. They're. I don't know. They have much more. I don't want to say they're better written, but they're just something more stimulating about them. There's that word.
Yeah, well, they are. I mean, they are just tonally, atmospherically, and they look beautiful, and they're crisp, and they're, you know, even when they're grungy, they look good, and they're shadowy, and you know, and very often there were, you know, there were great directors involved, and there were great writers involved. So many of them. I was just thinking about this writer, Daniel Fuchs, who I love, who was a Brooklyn novelist, wrote novels in the 30s, and then went to Hollywood and wrote scripts, and he wrote Crisscross, which is one of the great noirs, and he wrote The Gangster, which is terrific. And so there were great novelists who were brought out there and were working on a lot of those things.
You ever imagine what it would be like to go back, and if you were alive in that time, if you would be able to be a writer then, and what your life would be like? And do you think you could make it in the 30s and 40s as a writer?
You know, I do think about that a lot. Obviously, it was a bad time for a lot of people. If you were a writer of color, or, you know, a person of color, or you know, pretty much anybody, but not a white man. I guess it was not a good time. You know, probably not a thing you would want to imagine. But I mean, I am totally fascinated by that era, and so much fiction that I love comes out of that era, when people were just kind of figuring things out, and you know, the movies were just really getting going. So yeah, I do think about that, and I am influenced by so many writers from that time that it's hard not to get caught up imagining, or at least, you know, be fascinated by the subject and read about it as much as I can.
Well, I find it fascinating that during the war and during all that, like the racism stuff and the anti-Jew sentiment and just everything else, that they were able, with all of that going on in the world and all that pain and destruction and killing and all this stuff going on, and really you didn't know how it was going to end back then. It would be all up in the air, so it would be a really fearful time. But it's amazing how much good material came out of that. And I just wonder now with the COVID, for instance, and all the negativity the last few years, I wonder if we'll get the same sort of boom in good.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that's always interesting about that period to me is that, you know, very often they were working within constraints, right? Just like there's especially by mid 30s, there was the Hays Code in film, so they had to put a lot of the stuff under the surface, and they had to try to figure out ways to tell stories within the constraints of the code and still be effective. So, I mean, I think it put tension on the storytelling, and probably ultimately in a lot of ways made it even better.
Yeah, I'd like to go back as long as I had like modern technology.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I don't want to live like that. Wow. Website contacts. How do you like people to find you?
Oh, I'm all over the place. My website is just williammichaelboyle.com, and I'm on Twitter, WMBoyle4, and other places, but those are probably the main ones.
Yeah. Of course, we'll have that on our website, so listeners can find you with one click and stuff like that. And do you have like a Tinder or Grindr handle you want people to have, or no? You're staying away from that. Do you like having? Do you like interacting with people? Do you actually do that sort of thing, or are you kind of shy away from doing that?
I always like interacting with people, and we're talking about stuff we like, so it's fun, as long as that's what the conversation is, I love it, and we're talking about books we like and movies we like and music we like. That's great. That's one of my favorite things in the world to do. Anything, other than that, sometimes, I guess.
Yeah. I'll sit around and talk about Britney Spears and stuff. That's important things in life, right? Well, it's certainly been a pleasure, and glad you could make it on. And everyone, you've got to go buy this book. This is the book to have. Now, it comes out November 2nd, so on air date, this should be the 3rd, so it should be out now. So there's no excuses. Pick up the book. It's called Shoot the Moonlight Out, and it's a novel. The author was our guest, William Boyle. Thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was great talking to you guys.
Thanks, William.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.